There comes a moment in every life when the questions you've always ignored suddenly refuse to be silenced. When the meaning you've always accepted begins to unravel. For Leo Tolstoy, this moment arrived in his early 50s, at the height of his fame. After War and Peace, after Anna Karenina, when the world praised him as a literary genius, a moral voice, a cultural icon, and yet he was drowning. Not in failure, but in success. Surrounded by wealth, status, and admiration, Tolstoy fell into a spiritual crisis so deep, so consuming, that he came to believe life itself was impossible. And so began the unraveling, the death of old certainties. The moment Tolstoy stopped believing in everything, it's easy to assume despair comes to those who are broken, poor, forgotten, lost. But what happens when despair comes after you've achieved everything? Tolstoy had land, servants, a devoted wife, brilliant children. He had written some of the greatest novels in history, yet he confessed, "Something strange began to happen to me at age 50. I began to feel that I could no longer live." He wasn't physically ill. He wasn't going mad. He had simply lost the thread. The applause around him grew louder. And inside, a hollow silence. He began to ask questions he had pushed away for decades. What is the point of it all? Why do I write? Why do I wake up every day and continue? He realized he could answer none of them. And this is what terrified him most. Tolstoy wrote that it felt like the ground gave way beneath his feet. The things that once gave him meaning, family, literature, science, progress, no longer held up under the weight of his questioning. He saw through them, like a man suddenly aware that he's been walking in a dream. He wrote, "My question was the simplest of questions. What will come of what I do today or tomorrow? What will come of my entire life? Science could explain the mechanics of life, but not the why. Philosophy offered theories, but no comfort. Religion, at least the organized kind, seemed hollow to him. And so he descended into nihilism. He contemplated suicide. He wrote candidly, "The only thing that stopped me from taking my life was cowardice, the fear of doing something worse than living." That's how dark it had become. Not the absence of happiness, but the absence of meaning. Tolstoy began to look at all that he had accomplished. He had written War and Peace, a novel considered by many to be the greatest literary achievement of the modern world. He had captured the grandeur of history, the subtlety of the soul, the vastness of the Russian spirit. But in the quiet hours, in solitude, none of this could answer his inner ache. He wrote, "I could write brilliant works, and yet I did not know why I lived." The more he studied science and philosophy, the more he found no answers, only more theories. And theories, he realized, are not meaning. They are constructions, models, elegant mirrors that reflect nothing eternal. He turned to the greatest minds, Socrates, Spinoza, Kant. He pored over mathematics and Darwinism, but all of them seemed to whisper the same truth, that life had no ultimate meaning, that human beings are accidents in a meaningless universe, that death is the final punctuation to all stories, no matter how noble or kind or brilliant. This realization didn't comfort Tolstoy. It crushed him. He asked if death is inevitable. What is the meaning of this entire illusion? And so he stopped writing. He stopped teaching. He stopped trying to contribute to society, because he no longer knew what society even was, or whether it was built on anything true. One day, in the depths of this spiritual despair, Tolstoy looked out across his land, and he saw something strange. His peasants, simple farmers, laborers, shepherds, were laughing. They were singing songs, raising children, praying before meals, living, and not just surviving, but doing so with a quiet dignity he could not understand. He wrote, "The working people, they live more meaningful lives than the most brilliant philosophers. They suffer, they labor, they die, but they do not despair." How was it possible? They had less than him. No wealth, no titles, no fame, no libraries of philosophy. no theories of evolution or psychology. And yet they seemed to possess something he had lost. They had faith, a quiet, unshakable belief that life was sacred, that it mattered, that it was connected to something beyond reason. At first, Tolstoy resisted this idea. He had spent his life as a rationalist, a thinker, a realist, but slowly he began to soften. Maybe, just maybe, reason alone was not enough. Tolstoy began to suspect something that terrified him, that perhaps the deepest truths cannot be proven, only lived, that what gives life meaning might be felt, not explained. He began to walk alone in the forests around his estate. He would spend hours in silence, watching trees sway, watching the wind move through grass, and in these quiet moments, he began to feel something new, not happiness, not joy, but a strange kind of stillness, a sacred hush. He began to suspect that the soul isn't found in grand revelations, but in humble moments, in silence, in love, in presence. He wrote, "I came to believe that the meaning of life is not to be found in knowledge, but in the connection to something greater than oneself." He began to see God, not as a man in the sky, but as the quiet force that moves the universe, the love in a mother's eye, the mystery in death, the miracle in birth. He wasn't returning to dogma. He was seeking what he called the true religion of the heart, the lived religion, the experiential truth, not theology, but wisdom. The more Tolstoy meditated, reflected, and sat in stillness, the more he began to feel the presence of two selves within him: the public self, the writer, the intellectual, the landowner, and the silent self, the observer, the seeker, the soul watching everything unfold. And something inside him began to shift. He realized he could not live for both. Either he would continue performing for the world, or he would surrender entirely to what his soul was now asking for: simplicity, sincerity, truth. "The truth is, I was afraid of losing what I had," he wrote. "But what I had was precisely what was keeping me dead inside." This is where most people stop. They feel the calling of change, but cling to the comforts of identity. Tolstoy slowly, painfully, did the unthinkable. He began to let the old self die. Tolstoy was one of the wealthiest landowners in Russia. He had vast estates, serfs, royalties, and international acclaim. But none of it aligned with what he now believed to be true, and so he gave it up. He tried to renounce his copyrights. He stopped accepting money for his writing. He wore simple peasant clothing. He worked in the fields. He lived modestly, ate plainly, and practiced celibacy. His old friends thought he had gone mad. Critics called it a crisis. Society laughed, or whispered behind closed doors. But Tolstoy didn't care. He wasn't trying to be admired anymore. He was trying to be free. "I wanted to live a life not of falsehood but of truth," he wrote. "A life that aligned with the soul, not with the demands of society." This wasn't virtue signaling. It wasn't public performance. It was the raw struggle of a man trying to live without illusion. What replaced his former despair was not blind dogma. It was not institutional religion. It was a personal faith, a faith that was lived in every gesture, word, and act of kindness. Tolstoy's new philosophy was radical. He believed that all organized power, the state, the church, the courts, was based on violence, and that only love, pure, unforced, nonviolent love, was the answer to human suffering. This is what inspired Gandhi. This is what inspired Martin Luther King Jr. Tolstoy believed in resistance, but not with weapons. He believed in truth, but not with violence. He believed in God, but not in fear. "The kingdom of God is within you," he declared. Not in churches, not in rituals, but in the conscience, in love. This was not an abstract idea to him. It was his new way of life. Tolstoy's journey wasn't painless. In trying to live a spiritual life, he struggled deeply with his wife, Sophia. She didn't understand why the man she married, a writer, a celebrity, was now a barefoot ascetic. She feared for their security, their legacy, their children. And Tolstoy, for all his wisdom, was still human. He wrestled with guilt, with judgment, with pride, with sorrow. He loved his wife, but felt torn between his love and his newfound principles. This is where his teachings become most human. They're not about perfection. They're about the honest, brutal tension between what we feel and what we believe. To love purely is to want nothing in return, he wrote. But I am still learning how. His story became not one of final answers, but of eternal seeking. A man walking barefoot toward a light he could barely describe. It was autumn of 1910. Tolstoy was 82 years old, and once again he found himself suffocating. Despite having renounced wealth, despite his years of radical simplicity, Tolstoy still lived on his family estate, Yasnaya Polyana, still surrounded by reminders of the old world, still caught in emotional tension with his wife, Sophia. And one night, quietly, without ceremony, he packed a small bag, left a note, and vanished. No destination, no clear plan, just the deep, irresistible need for final freedom. I am doing what old men of my age often do, he wrote. I am leaving the worldly life behind and seeking solitude before I die. He boarded a train. No servants, no entourage, just a coat, a hat, a copy of the Gospels, and with that he slipped away from everything again. But the journey took its toll. Exhausted, ill, and with nowhere to go, Tolstoy collapsed at a tiny rural train station called Ostapovo. There in the station master's home, the greatest writer of the Russian language lay dying on a simple wooden bed. He refused the luxury of being transferred to a hospital. He refused to see priests or officials. He allowed only the most modest care. Journalists surrounded the station. Crowds gathered outside, waiting for news. But inside it was silent, peaceful, still. Tolstoy spent his last days in quiet, drinking water, speaking little, looking inward. And then on November 20th, 1910, he died, not in a palace, not on stage, but in obscurity. In a railway station in the Russian countryside, he had left everything behind: wealth, titles, fame, even family. And in doing so he became immortal. Tolstoy didn't just leave behind novels. He left behind a blueprint, a spiritual rebellion, a refusal to accept comfort over truth, a radical belief that love, not control, not punishment, was the foundation of human dignity. His later works, The Kingdom of God is Within You, A Confession, and his essays on nonviolence, inspired Gandhi, who called Tolstoy one of the greatest teachers of nonviolent resistance. Martin Luther King Jr. read Tolstoy's teachings as a young seminary student. His idea of soul force, the power of love in the face of evil, was directly drawn from Tolstoy. Even now, in a world of distraction and noise, Tolstoy's life reminds us that it's not enough to speak truth. You must live it, even when it's inconvenient, even when it costs everything. Tolstoy's journey wasn't about becoming perfect. It was about becoming real. He was flawed, contradictory, often torn between duty and longing. But he kept asking the question, what does it mean to live a good life? And that question, not the answers, is what made him great. Today we are surrounded by illusion, social performance, shallow virtue, 1,000 distractions from our true selves. But deep beneath the noise, Tolstoy's voice still echoes. There is something inside you that knows. It is quiet. It does not shout. But if you listen, it will lead you to the truth. And maybe that's why Tolstoy's story still matters, because it shows us that the moment you stop believing in everything, when the world no longer satisfies, when the old meanings collapse, that's not the end, it's the beginning. A quiet beginning, one step at a time, toward the truth inside. You don't need a mansion to live well. You don't need a platform to be heard. You don't need applause to be real. What you need is the courage to live like your soul is watching, because it is.